Vicky Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It isn't really surprising that, having spent 2 years in this Parliament with large chunks of the economy and the NHS shut down while we fought a disease, that we are still facing challenges coming out of that. And sometimes when I listen to speeches from around this chamber with the constant wish list for more and more money, I think we ought to all remind ourselves of that, and also remind ourselves that there are lots of people running businesses up and down this country who are really being taken for granted about having additional burdens put on them when they are carrying as much additional debt as we, as guardians of the taxpayer's pound, are, given what we've spent. We've taken on what is effectively a wartime debt in fighting the pandemic, and we must recognise that that will have consequences where we'd all be a lot better off. We could afford to be much more generous with taxpayers' money had we not been through that. But I want to really focus on some of the issues which were in the King's speech and which were not. And firstly, one of the things that was not was the reform of the Mental Health Act, and I add my voice to those from around the chamber who have expressed regret about that. Yeah, I was fortunately a minister who commenced that work 5 years ago, and it's particularly personal to me because we raised expectations that we were really going to deliver parity of esteem by that change. The Mental Health Act was passed in 1983. That was an era when we viewed people with severe mental health as a problem to be managed, and we all wanted to look the other way. It wasn't something that we wanted to deal with. And we've seen a sea change in public attitudes towards that, and it was finally being recognised in government. And it was a privilege to me to sit down with a lot of campaigners who told me their experiences. And what makes it personal to me is that I actually witnessed them reliving the trauma that they experienced under detention, and I feel personally responsible that, having raised their expectations 5 years ago, we've let them down by not legislating. So my message to the front bench is, where it was not in the King's speech, but it can still be brought forward, and I would like to encourage them to do that, because until we do, we are not genuinely delivering parity of esteem. And we can't, it's all very well talking about, we're doing more resources into schools and we're tackling suicide prevention. They're two different things. We need to have a proper approach to dealing with severe mental ill health. And for those, this will enhance the rights of people who are being, having to be treated. Of course, there are occasions where people need to have their liberty taken away from them, but it's not an absolute. They still have an ownership over what happens to them. And when you hear stories about people in detention just being constantly medicated by drugs, that is not something that I equate with our society. And it is important that the government's first priority is to make sure it does its best for the most vulnerable. Another item of legislation long promised that wasn't in the King's speech was the ban on conversion therapy. And I just want to issue a word of warning, really, to the House. It is very clear to me that there is a majority in this chamber for a ban on conversion therapy. It is also very clear to me that every one of us, I would hope, would wish to see abusive and coercive practices designed to cure people of their sexuality to be banned and to be outlawed. But the thing that really bothers me is that when we're talking about these practices, which are abusive and coercive, that we actually use the term therapy. Therapy is something which is used which is designed to alleviate distress. And the practices we really want to outlaw cannot be in any way described in such a manner. Now, I've been really pleased with the engagement I've had with government and with campaigners on all sides about how we get the language on this right. And I think we've moved a long way in the right direction, that we are really looking at practices which are designed to cause harm and are abusive. So I would just say to those members, and I know that there's lots of discussions happening, those members who are thinking about bringing perhaps a private member's bill to resurrect the ban on conversion therapy, can we just actually remove this term therapy from anything designed to change people's sexuality? We know that ultimately therapy should be designed only to describe processes which are designed to alleviate distress. Turning now actually to some more local issues, and I want to talk about the National Health Service in South Essex. Now, we have had for a long time a very challenging position in South Essex. We are sitting right next to London. We know that if you're a National Health Service professional, there are much more attractive places to work when you've got the great teaching hospitals in London, and we've always found it very difficult to recruit the staff that we need in South Essex. And in fact, in Thurrock, in my constituency, we've been under GP'd for decades. And I think at this time, where we've got an NHS which is dealing with the backlog caused by the pandemic and the waiting lists, we are seeing some quite acute problems. And I was drawn, in fact, to an article I read in the press just this weekend when I read that, along the Thames, just a little bit down the road in Southend, as many as 1 in 5 people are awaiting treatment on a waiting list. And I'm really sad to say that wasn't a surprise to me. But it's going back to 2015, the ministers at the time gripped the issue that provision of health in South Essex was a particular challenge, and there was a great focus made on it. There was a proposal, obviously, in terms of developing the ICS. We looked very closely at what made the best health economy, and there was a recognition that improving primary care in South Essex ought to be a priority. And we seem to have lost that focus. And my challenge really is, what has happened to our commissioning system for that to happen? We thought that moving towards ICS was going to actually give a better focus, but it seems to have fundamentally failed. And 6 years ago, as part of this process, my local NHS brought forward a proposal to close what was remained of Orsett Hospital in Thurrock. Now, Orsett Hospital ceased to be a general hospital decades ago. However, it still retains a great deal of affection amongst my constituents, mainly because most of them were born there. But I took it upon myself to support my local NHS when they said they wanted to close what remained of Orsett Hospital and reinvest in new services in the community. I supported that. I was prepared to take the political flak because it's very difficult to deliver that message to constituents. But I believed them when they said this would bring new facilities, and they promised me an urgent treatment centre, actually in Grays in my constituency. I was promised 3 new integrated medical centres. Mr. Speaker, I haven't received any one of those things in 6 years. So I took the flak, I persuaded my constituents this was in their best interest, and now I'm looking a fool. And I'm looking a fool because basically you have a circular system within our commissioning system in the NHS where lots of papers get produced, but there's no actual delivery. And we really do need to get to grips with this because when we raise issues about the NHS, people think, oh, how dare we criticise our doctors and nurses? Actually, we're not. We're criticising failings in how services are commissioned. And every time we look at this, we never see any improvements. And I do think it needs to be done. I mean, I'm now looking in Tilbury at the hoardings around a site where we're going to build an integrated medical centre. They've been there for 2 years because we cleared the site ready, but we are still getting a circular conversation with the NHS in South Essex, and that really needs to change. I just want to use the last bit of time I have available is to talk about the COVID inquiry and what that tells us about how government works now and what we should be doing with our institutions. It's really not very pretty, is it, to see some of the film that's coming out. And I think as we move on from the King's speech, and we're having a new government assembled in front of us, I think we should reflect on some of the really bad behaviours that are being highlighted as part of that inquiry. The last few years we've seen some very bad behaviour here in Parliament, as well as relationships between ministers and civil servants in Whitehall. I think we should remember that the impartiality of our civil service is something to be valued. The way we've operated our government has given stable government for decades. We've seen a massive expansion in the number of special advisors. which has actually led to the marginalisation of junior ministers here and a subsequent lack of accountability here. Here is where the action should be. Ministers are responsible to Parliament for what happens in their departments, and special advisers seem to be breeding apace but doing nothing to actually improve the quality of that government.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.